Welcome to the Paranormal Bedtime Stories podcast. I'm author Todd Chapman, your host. Join me as we explore the mysterious world of the supernatural. From encounters with aliens to sightings of Bigfoot, we delve into it all. I've experienced the paranormal since childhood and even had a near-death experience that led me to become a contact tour guide in Sedona, Arizona. Now, I bring you first-hand accounts from those tours and from individuals who I've interviewed. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell to never miss an episode. You can find my books in paperback and for Kindle at Amazon.com or by using the link in my bio. Now, on to our story. A mother and daughter were driving home after work. It was already dark, and it was also snowing, making the road slippery. Fortunately, they were driving more carefully and slower than normal on the winding river road. As they came around a bend and the road ahead straightened out, they noticed something large standing on the side of the road. It was around 8 feet tall and was covered in snow. Strangely, it appeared to be watching them approach. They slowed down even more to get a better look. That's when it walked out in front of them. As it neared the middle of the road, it looked back at them. Once across the road, it made its way into the woods. Both women questioned each other in case they imagined it. It looked like a Bigfoot, but wasn't the usual brown or black color. This one was silver, with highlights of white from the snow. Continuing home, they talked about what they witnessed. In the end, both agreed on seeing the same thing, but still concluded it was their imagination. The following night, they made the same trip home after work. When they reached the bend in the road, they were stunned to see the same silver-haired Sasquatch standing on the side of the road. It was as if it was waiting for us, the mother told me. "What makes you say that?" I replied. "Well, it waited for us to again slow the vehicle as we approached. Then it walked out into the road like the night before. However, this time it stopped right in the middle of the road and just stared at us. I stopped the car and waited. After what seemed like an eternity, it turned and continued off the road and into the woods, exactly where we saw it go in the night before." So, to get to your question, it was like it was letting us get a real good look, so there was no way it was our imagination. "Wow," I said. "That's crazy. It's almost like it knew that you two said it was just your imagination and that you were both seeing things." She told me that she never saw it again. In 2003, a family of 3 went hiking in the mountains surrounding a lake. The mother told me that while she was admiring the view, she received a frantic call on her two-way radio. It was her son. He was hiking alone on the other side of the lake from where they were. "What's wrong?" she asked. He was panting and out of breath. "I think something's chasing me." "What do you mean?" Silence. His father jumped on the radio. "Where are you, son?" "I'm up on the slope to the north of the lake." "Okay, head back to the lake as quickly as you can," his dad instructed. When the 3 of them were together again, the boy was out of breath and kept looking back over his shoulder. "What was it?" his mom asked. "I don't know for sure. It was bigger than a bear, was covered in black hair, and walked on all 4s. Well, at least at first." "What do you mean?" his dad asked. "It stood up and switched to 2 legs and came after me." They made their way to the truck, and no one said a word the whole drive back to town. What makes this story even more interesting is that locals have seen a large bipedal creature in the area for many years. In Book 1, I shared a story about a motorist who saw a massive gorilla-like creature chasing a deer across the highway in front of him. This was the same young man. Do you believe in coincidences? If not, do you think it is possible that the creature that chased him down the mountain was the same creature that looked at him before it continued to chase that deer years later? Have you ever shopped at REI, Sportsman's Warehouse, Bass Pro Shops, Cabela's, or a similar outdoor store? If so, take a moment and consider what it might be like to work at one of these stores and some of the strange stories you might hear from customers. In a way, it's actually a great place to engage people about their experiences and if they ever encountered something strange or unusual while biking, boating, camping, hiking, or hunting. This story is about a 28-year-old man that walked into a Bass Pro Shop store in Florida. He was looking for a new compound bow for the upcoming elk season. While chatting with the store's employee about prior hunting locations, big game, and such, the customer opened up and shared a traumatic story that he'd never shared with anyone during the 12 years since it happened. He only did so after the employee admitted he believed in Bigfoot and actually saw one out west where he used to hunt. In fact, they'd both been to and hunted in similar areas. The man's story took place 12 years earlier, when he was just 16 years old and while hiking with a friend at the Philmont Boy Scout Ranch in New Mexico. Philmont currently covers 140,000 acres of wilderness near the southern end of the Rocky Mountains. He began, "During our 2 weeks of hiking, we both put over 100 miles on our boots. We enjoyed the rugged terrain, lush meadows, thick forests, trout-filled streams, and hidden natural treasures. In fact, we were having a great time, until we realized we were lost. Imagine being 16 years old and lost within an area that large. It was crazy. The ranch land covers over 200 square miles and is full of all sorts of wild animals, namely black bear." To add perspective to their situation, in 1986, Philmont had 5 separate bear attacks on campers during a 2-week period. In 2000, 4 more campers reported being attacked, and most recently, in 2010, a 14-year-old boy was sleeping inside his tent when a bear climbed onto the tent and bit the boy. There was even a version of this report that claimed the boy was dragged out of the tent by the butt. He'd gone to sleep with a candy bar in his back pocket, and that attracted the hungry bear. This man continued his story, saying, "During our second night of being lost, we had just finished making camp and had started a small fire. It was getting pretty cold at night, so we both wanted to warm up a bit at the fire before collecting more wood to get us through the night. That decision might have actually saved our lives. While sitting next to the fire and contemplating our situation, we both realized we weren't alone. There, standing quietly next to a tree at the edge of our campsite, was a massive hairy creature. Where it came from and how long it had been watching us, we did not know. We didn't hear or see it walk up. As we both sat frozen in fear, I remember being unable to rationalize a way out of our situation and even thought that we were going to die and nobody knew where we were. Besides, if we could somehow escape, we didn't know which way to run and for how long. We were lost. This thing was just massive, and we were sitting on the ground at a distance too close for comfort. In a manner of speaking, we were sitting ducks. The store employee jumped in with a question. "What did you mean? That the decision to warm at the fire may have saved your lives? Can you imagine what might have happened if my friend and I left our camp in different directions and went into the darkness looking for firewood? What if the creature or creatures were out there waiting for us? I see what you mean. Yeah, that could have been really bad." He continued, "I'm not sure how long we sat there looking at it without making a sound or making a move. Likewise, it remained there motionless, but we could hear it breathe. It must have huge lungs, with the sound it made breathing. I still can't get over how massive it was. I keep using the word massive, as that's all I can think of to describe it." The employee asked, "So what happened? How did you get away from it?" After a while, it simply turned around and walked deeper into the forest. Neither of us slept a wink. The whole experience from our trip and everything we thoroughly enjoyed up to that point has been, for the most part, forgotten. Or maybe replaced is a better word. The confusion and fear, compounded with being lost so far from home, made us want to repress what happened. In fact, My friend and I never talked about what happened or told anyone. Until now, talking with you here. Man, that's a really crazy story. You obviously found your way back to civilization. How did you get back? At first light, we broke camp and headed for the nearest high point and started climbing. We found some landmarks which were on our map, and that led us back to the main buildings and parking area. We were thrilled, but also mentally and emotionally exhausted. Neither of us has returned to Philmont or New Mexico. So, where are you headed with this new bow? Asked the store employee. I'm going on a solo hunt with a guide up in Idaho. I hear they have nice elk. Your friend isn't going with you then? No, he doesn't hunt. Actually, he doesn't get out that much anymore. He's got a family and a demanding job to keep him busy. Man, thanks for sharing your story, and I'm glad you guys made it out safely. I don't know what I would have done in the same situation. Good luck with your hunt too. This was an amazing story, but what you don't know is that the store employee has also been to the Philmont Boy Scout Ranch. What are the odds of that? Having a fellow hunter to confide in is great, but it's even easier when they've seen one of these creatures as well and have even been to the area where you saw it. Over the years, I've met Forest Service rangers, rock climbers, and a handful of others who once worked at Philmont. I bet there are many more Philmont stories out there. While on vacation, a middle-aged couple decided to rent a Jeep for a day trip up the mountain. They rented Jeeps for my friend in the past, so they decided to stop by to say hello and see if anything was available. As luck would have it, he had a Jeep for them. While filling out the rental agreement, they asked about one of their favorite restaurants a couple of blocks down the road. He told them it closed because the managers were way behind on rent and got in some trouble with the IRS. The owner returned and closed its doors. It's been for sale since. As it turns out, this couple knew the owner and, in fact, were his neighbors back in Texas. My friend replied, "My family purchased the lodge next to the restaurant from the same guy many years back." A life in the past conversation ensued, and then they told him this unbelievable story. Almost home one hot Texas afternoon, up ahead, we saw several official-looking vehicles parked on the side of the road. We then saw a small group of men walking around in the field off in the distance. They were on our property and appeared to be looking for something. They continued, coming up to the stop sign. We recognized our neighbor among the men. We continued home and dropped the kids off before returning to see what was going on. My friend asked, "What was going on?" Evidently, our neighbor reported a werewolf walking upright through the field. The authorities came out to look for tracks or other evidence. Nothing was ever found. In light of the strangeness of the whole thing, and this man's history of run-ins with the law, they suspect the incident was likely written off as substance-induced hallucination. My friend, like this couple, got a good laugh out of it. When my friend told me the story, I did not laugh. "It could have been a dogman," I suggested. "What do you mean?" he replied. Up to that point, he'd never heard of dogmen or their multitude of stories and sightings from Oklahoma and Texas over the years. The area where this incident took place is in North Texas and not far from the Oklahoma border. Even so, nobody will believe the man due to his criminal background and known drug use. One summer morning a few years back, two friends, Dan and Josiah, went hiking deep into a canyon just outside of town. Their plan was to build a large teepee-like structure using fallen timber. It would be a gift to the area's Sasquatch people. They arrived at their destination about 3 miles out of town and paused to look around. By the looks of things, they'd probably need to venture a bit higher up the mountain and deeper into the woods for enough material for the structure. They blazed a trail as they made their way, adding another half-mile to the trek before they came upon a fairly level clearing with a tree stump near the middle of it. It was the perfect location for their gift. They split up and started collecting skinny 10 to 15-foot tall timber to erect into the structure around the tree stump. The stump would act as a table within the teepee. The door or opening was about 5 or 6 feet tall. Once the structure was in place and standing on its own, they filled in gaps with smaller sticks, branches, and leaves to help keep the rain out. When they were done, they left a granola bar on the stump and headed back down the mountain. After they arrived at their car, they packed up and began their slow drive back out of the canyon. Just when they were about to make the bend in the road, something moving up on the ridge caught their attention, and it was the ridge they were just on. There, running on the ridge, was a reddish-brown-haired Sasquatch, quickly making its way down the mountain toward them. When the creature reached the edge of the hill and saw the car, it stopped and just looked at them. As they looked back at it, and as if it realized they'd seen it, it morphed into a tree, blending into the rest of the hillside. 1 second it was standing there, and the next instant it was a small pine tree. Was it a sort of defense mechanism or camouflage technique used to remain unseen from prey and humans? It really didn't matter at that point, as they'd already seen it. It would be a while after that before Dan went camping in that canyon. Everything seemed normal until one morning he awoke to find a small, light blue marble laying next to his sleeping bag. The marble had a piece of reddish-brown hair embedded inside it. What did this mean? Was it a gift from that Sasquatch? Months later, Dan decided to venture out alone for an evening, hike up another Forest Service road, and then head off the trail to find a remote camping spot. As the crow flies, the location of this trip's campsite would be no more than 4 miles from the clearing him and Josiah built that teepee. He didn't have to venture off the trail for too long before coming upon a nice level spot, perfect for his 2-person tent. He was surrounded by tall trees which served to block out any noise from town, which was less than a mile below. It wasn't long before camp was made, and his dinner was gone. For good measure, he backtracked through the woods to find a tree branch to hang a small bag of garbage. That would hopefully keep any nosy bears distracted and away from his tent as he slept. Before turning in for the night, he pulled a canister of bear spray out of his backpack and grabbed a book for some light reading. Nearly an hour later, he rolled over and turned out the light and went to bed. Sometime during the early morning hours, he was jolted awake by a deep rumbling feeling coming from the ground and the sound of a bulldozer crashing through the trees. It sounded like it was about 50 yards away and coming towards his campsite. The rumbling wasn't like an earthquake, but more like a stampede of horses or cattle running right at him. But how could that be? He was nestled deep in the woods and far away from the road. He wondered, were there free-range cattle in the area and were possibly spooked or attacked, causing them away from a predator and unknowingly towards him? As the approaching violence got closer and closer, his sleepy brain was simply overcome by the trembling ground and the loud crashing sound of the large trees right outside his tent. As he clenched his bear spray, he closed his eyes and braced for impact. Then everything stopped. Everything was suddenly quiet and peaceful. He opened his eyes and focused his hearing as he could sense something at the edge of his campsite to the left of his tent. There was no way he was going to look outside, so he continued to listen for any clue to what was outside. It took less than a minute for whatever was outside to turn around and slowly walk away in the direction it came. Dan lay in his sleeping bag holding his breath. He could feel the heavy thuds from its feet as whatever it was walked away on 2 legs. Needless to say, Dan didn't go back to bed. He couldn't sleep. He lay helpless as his mind replayed every second of the event over and over again, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Come morning, he cautiously unzipped his tent and slowly and quietly climbed out of his tent. With every inch, he'd pause all body movement and hold his breath to scan to the left and to the right before climbing further out. He was pretty shaken up. Whatever it was gone. There was no visible destruction within his campsite, and even more alarming, The trail back to the road was clear of any sign of the violence he'd both heard and felt. Even the garbage bag was still hanging from the tree. Dan gave a lot of thought to what happened before telling me about that wild night. Whatever it was, once it found me asleep with the campfire put out properly, it turned around and let me be. I hadn't been making a lot of noise and my fire had been small, so I'm not sure how it knew where I was. Dan wasn't the only one to have follow-up experiences. During a solo afternoon hike, Josiah found himself about a mile or more outside of town, on the opposite side of town from where he and Dan built the teepee. It was early evening when he set out. As he hiked parallel to a river, he eventually came upon a batch of similar teepee tree structures. They had been created by Boy Scouts and varied in sizes and distance from the trail. Hikers and campers used them as shelters. After he passed the first structure, he suddenly felt like something was circling him. It was such a strong feeling. It made him pause to look around to see if he could see anyone or anything nearby. That's when he felt the need to look down. There in front of his feet was an arrowhead, but it wasn't any normal arrowhead. Josiah is part Native American and has seen a lot of arrowheads and knows how to make them. This one was different. Whereas they're usually created using a chipping or flaking method, this one seemed more like it was rubbed into shape. By this time it was getting dark, so he hiked up to one of the teepees and climbed inside to rest and examine the arrowhead. While inside, he heard small stones being tossed at the teepee. He leaned over and stuck his head outside, but he didn't see anyone. The sound of stones hitting the structure continued, so he decided to take the hint and move along. Obviously, someone didn't want him there. That's when things got a bit more strange. As he retreated back down the slope toward the trail, the stones continued to land all around him. At the trail, and after stopping to look for the culprit once more, a large piece of tree bark suddenly manifested from thin air right in front of him. He said it wasn't there, and then it was. He watched as it hovered in front of his face briefly, then fell to the ground. It was as if someone dangled it in front of him for a moment, and then simply let it fall to the ground. This freaked him out, so rather than continue up the trail, he decided to quickly backtrack toward town. A ways down the trail, he realized he dropped the cap to his camera. Reluctantly, he turned back up the trail and used his flashlight to scan the ground ahead of him. Just as he spotted it and bent over to pick it up, someone threw something very large and heavy in his direction. When it made impact with the ground, he literally jumped and yelled, "I'm just coming back for this." Josiah then hastily made his way back into town and to his cabin. That was the last time he's hiked that area alone. What follows is a conversation I had with someone I met in a parking lot of all places. It is highly unbelievable, but if his story is true, raises some intriguing questions. Specifically, we already know Bigfoot are masters at blending into their environment, but what if they can blend into our environment too? For instance, what would they do for a living and how would they interact with neighbors? The Munsters and Addams Family TV shows come to mind. One afternoon while grocery shopping in the city, I exited the store and made my way to my vehicle. While loading the groceries into the trunk, an approaching truck caught my attention. It looked like someone's work truck with their logo on the door. As fate would have it, they pulled up next to me. The driver saw me looking at his business name and logo on the door. After he and his wife got out, I asked him about it. I won't give the exact name here, but it had the name Bigfoot in it. Specifically, I asked why he named his business what he did. He looked over at his wife and said they just had a child and the baby had pretty big feet for being a newborn. I looked at him and paused. Oh, okay. I thought maybe it had something to do with Sasquatch. Then he looked back at me and paused. Really? Do you believe in Bigfoot? Yes, I do. I've interacted with them in 5 different states over the years. What do they look like? He asked. Well, I've seen a couple of different types, you might say. The first type is the typical large hairy creature, and the second is, well, very human-like. They don't have much hair at all and look more like us than the first type, but they are still large like the hairy ones and have feet larger than ours. I think this caught him off guard, as he looked away from me and over at his truck for about 10 seconds before looking back at me. You mean some of them can look like us? Yeah. He stared into the distance for a moment. Then I asked, have you seen one before? Looking back at me, he appeared to be debating whether to answer truthfully. Well, I used to work for this man that was really big. I mean, really big, and he had more body hair than normal. How big was he? Almost 8 feet tall, and he had a massive, muscular body. He continued, curious. I asked him once where he was from, and he told me Alamosa, Colorado. That's interesting, I replied. Interesting, why? Well, those mountains outside of Alamosa have a long history of Bigfoot sightings. Maybe that was his way of saying where he was from without meaning the city of Alamosa. You know, Alamosa's the biggest town in that area. People may know of it, and that would be enough. He looked at me for a moment before continuing. You know, I also asked him about his shoes and clothes, like where he got them, as they were way bigger than anything I'd ever seen. He told me they are custom made for him and his family. After pausing again, he added, he shaved a lot too, like his whole body. He told me that too, once. You know, he continued before collecting his thoughts, I once dropped a large tree off at his place and before leaving, said I'd help him move it with my tractor. He told me not to worry about it, that he'd take care of it. I didn't understand. He didn't have a tractor, and I was there with mine. It would only take a couple minutes, so I insisted and climbed down from my truck. He just looked at me and then walked over to the log and wrapped his arms around the end and lifted it up to his waist. What? Yeah, I still can't figure that one out. It weighed about 5 tons. He just picked it up and moved it with ease. Smiling, I looked at my new friend and asked, so, did you really name your business after your son's big feet? He laughed, no. This is where that conversation ended. I realize many people believe Sasquatch is a beast, monster, an apex predator. Nothing more. However, there exist many accounts which suggest this creature is intelligent, compassionate, protective of their own as well as humans, and in many ways, human-like. Besides being humanoid, they have mates, rear children, grow old, and die like us. Some accounts suggest they have different roles within their clan or tribe. They have also engaged in gift-giving and other forms of curiosity and communication with humans. They may even have a sense of humor. Finally, witnesses report they look very human, and some hunters couldn't shoot it as it looked like a hairy person. Some Bigfoot have a face like a gorilla, some like a Neanderthal, and some very human like ours. Finally, there are accounts of people talking with them verbally as well as telepathically. Some have even received handwritten notes in English and drawings from the Bigfoot. So, what if Bigfoot comes in several types, sizes, shapes, colors, etc.? Take dinosaurs, for example. Dinosaurs come in a variety of species, types, sizes, shapes, colors, and diets, but all are still referred to as dinosaurs. In the case of Bigfoot, might the same be true? It could account for all the varied descriptions and behaviors. With all of this in mind, I'd like to pose a question. If someone claims to have spent time living with or among Bigfoot, and if true, is it possible for Bigfoot to assimilate into our communities and way of life? Admittedly, reports of people being kidnapped by Bigfoot or going with them willingly are rare, yet accounts do exist. Could the opposite be possible? What if this man's story is true? While at a local restaurant for dinner with friends, a woman approached my table. The hostess was a friend, and new people had been sharing their Bigfoot stories with me. She introduced me to a woman who had a story I might like to hear. Her story went like this. A man pulled his travel trailer up to one of the area's lakes for a few days of camping and fishing. It was raining, and as he lay in bed trying to go to sleep, sudden screams and howls broke out from the surrounding hills. He did not know what was making the noises, and they persisted to keep him awake. Frustrated, he got up and went outside to fire off a few rounds from his gun. Silence. He returned to his bunk and, as he was about to doze off, something violently rocked and shook his camper from side to side. This continued to keep him awake until he passed out from fear and exhaustion. When he awoke, the sun was up and the rain had stopped. So too did the harassment. He cautiously exited the camper and walked around his rig, looking for damage. There was none, but he saw some very large 17-inch footprints in the wet soil all around his trailer. It wasn't a dream after all. It really happened. This terrified him. He packed up and hauled his butt back down the mountain. I don't know how this woman learned of his encounter, but suspect the man lived in the area as not too many outsiders know how to get there. He may have shared his experience with someone she knew. After she told me this story, I asked when it took place. She said, a couple of weeks earlier. That was interesting to me, as I was up at the lake the same day or the day before this man arrived. A friend and I had visited the lake to photograph it from the air with a drone. As we got out of the car and started looking for a good place to launch the drone, I got the distinct feeling they were in the area. From the sound of the man's story, they were. One evening, my friend Tammy and her family were quietly at home preparing for bed, when her and her husband Jim heard a ruckus coming from the garbage dumpster down the hill at the end of their driveway. It's one of those big brown dumpsters that belongs to the county and is where they and their two neighbors place their garbage for pickup every 2 weeks. The ruckus coming from the dumpster sounded like a bear was trying to get inside for a late-night snack. Tammy looked over at Jim and asked if he'd locked the dumpster lids after taking the garbage out earlier that day. This is common practice when you live in the mountains during the spring and summer months. Jim said he did. So they both shrugged their shoulders and figured the bear would move on to another dumpster when it couldn't get inside theirs. This has happened many times before whenever they forget to lock the lids or before they hear that the bears are out of hibernation. However, they soon heard more loud thumps and bangs. Then there was the unmistakable slow screech from the rusty hinges. The bear just managed to open the lock and lifted the lid to get inside. "Crap!" yelled Tammy as they both jumped to their feet. Jim reached for the flashlight while Tammy switched on the front porch light, and before they both stepped outside onto their porch. Using the beam from the flashlight, they could both see the large hungry bear with black fur digging around inside the dumpster. "So you locked the dumpster, huh?" she said. Jim huffed and just looked back at her. "Yes, I did," while rolling his eyes. Bang! That was the second lip falling backwards against the top of the dumpster. When they returned their gaze upon the bear, they could tell it was still digging around inside the container, but something wasn't right. The bear didn't jump inside or climb up on top of the bin like they usually do. "What is that laying on the ground next to the dumpster?" Tammy asked. Jim squinted his eyes a bit to better his focus in the low light. "It looks like a couple of trash bags. Those look like the trash bags I took out earlier today," he concluded. They looked at each other with a puzzled look on their faces as the bear appeared to be shuffling the trash around. Jim didn't want to clean up the expected mess, so he yelled at the bear to go away. "Yeah. Hey, bear. Yeah." Then the ruckus stopped, and the bear lowered the lid and stood up straight, looking back at them. "Oh, crap," said Tammy. "That's a Bigfoot." They've heard about several sightings before, but those happened 10 to 15 miles away. This was too close, and it shocked them. They didn't know Sasquatches came around people's homes like this. As the 8 to 9 foot tall Sasquatch stared back at them, all Jim could say was, "Sorry to bother you. We'll go back inside now and let you continue with your business." Jim turned and looked at Tammy, then motioned her to come inside with him. Once back in the living room, Tammy reached back for the light switch out of habit. Then as she was about to turn off the porch light, she thought it best to leave it on to give their unusual neighbors some light in case they needed it. Jim and Tammy stayed up talking about the incident for about 30 more minutes before turning in. The kids were still in their bedrooms and didn't hear any of what had just transpired. Their bedrooms were on the back side of the house, so they didn't see the porch light come on or the visiting Sasquatch. Tammy and Jim agreed not to say anything to the children, but would tell them not to stay out after dark just to be safe. In the morning, Tammy was the first to get up and, after turning on the coffee maker, put her slippers on and quietly walked outside and to the end of their driveway. The previous night's events were weighing heavily on her mind. As she made her way closer and closer to the dumpster, she noticed the garbage bags were nowhere in sight. She was sure they would have a mess to clean up, with the ravens and other critters looking for a morning feast. Where are the garbage bags? Did the Sasquatch take them with him? She wondered. She reached the end of the driveway and turned to the left to approach the two-lid dumpster. "Oh my God," she said softly to herself. Standing motionless about 6 feet from the dumpster, Tammy just stared at the locks and tried to make sense of what she was looking at. "The locks are secured in place on both lids," she mumbled aloud. By this time, Jim had seen her from inside the living room and went out to join her. She hadn't heard him approaching, but his presence next to her jarred her out of deep thought. Was the whole thing just a dream of some sort? She asked. Unsure what she meant, he asked what she was talking about. Tammy lifted her right arm and pointed at the locked lids before looking back at him. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "See, I told you I locked the dumpster." Jim let out a chuckle and walked over to the dumpster to unlock the lids. "I wonder what it was looking for," Tammy said. "If it was a bear, it was looking for food. But it wasn't a bear. So was it also looking for food?" Looking inside the dumpster, Jim said, "Everything looks normal. No bags are torn apart, and the 2 kitchen bags I put in here yesterday are right where I put them." "What do you mean, Jim?" "That Sasquatch put them back inside the dumpster, then locked the lids and left?" She was confused. Would a Bigfoot really do that? Jim didn't answer. He didn't know the answer and was curious. What was the Bigfoot looking for if not food scraps? "I don't know," she said. "Maybe the neighbors saw the bags beside the dumpster this morning and put them inside so the birds wouldn't get at them and make a mess." It sounded logical, but then Jim noticed something. "Wait a minute," he said, as he pulled the garbage bags out one by one and placed them on the ground. He continued to remove everything until he could see to the bottom of the bin. Something was missing. "Tammy, come look at this," he said as he motioned to her while pointing inside the dumpster. She looked inside and didn't see anything unusual, but then it clicked. "The broken rocking horse is missing," she exclaimed. "Do you think it took it? Or maybe one of the neighbors saw it and took it?" "I don't know. Maybe they did," Jim wondered. Then he continued, "But if they didn't and the Sasquatch took it, do you think it knew it was here and came for it once it got late and we were getting ready for bed?" That was a loaded question, and he knew it. Tammy replied, "That would mean it was watching us, right? But from where? And what would that huge Bigfoot want with a toddler's broken rocking horse?" Then it made sense. Whether or not it knew the rocking horse was there didn't really matter. They could simply ask the neighbors if they pulled it from the garbage. Jim replied, "What was important was that it may have been the father of a young Sasquatch, and that there could be a family of them nearby." While they discussed the matter, their 2 kids had gotten out of bed and noticed the house was empty. Looking around for their parents, they spotted them outside at the road. They both put on shoes and walked out to join their parents. Billy, their 12-year-old son, asked, "What's going on and why is the trash piled up in the yard?" Jim and Tammy just looked at each other. They weren't prepared to discuss what had happened the night before, and they still didn't know what to say. After all, what were they doing at the dumpster with a big pile of garbage laying at their feet? What did the neighbors think? Tammy looked at her husband and said, Just tell them. They're old enough." "Old enough for what?" their daughter Sarah chimed in. "Last night, after you two went to bed, we had a visitor. He, or it, was going through our garbage, but didn't make a mess or dig through the garbage bags." Their dad continued, "Your mother and I thought it was just another bear, but it managed to unlock the lids, and when we yelled at it, it stood up and looked at us." "It wasn't a bear," Billy asked. "What was it?" "It looked like a Bigfoot," his dad continued. "We left it alone and went to bed. This morning, your mother and I came out to see what it may have been looking for or what it took out." Their mother added, "We both agree that for the time being, we want both of you to be inside the house by the time it gets dark. No playing outside after dark until we know more. Okay?" "Okay," Billy and Sarah said at the same time. The day went on as normal as possible. The kids played with friends for most of the afternoon before returning home for dinner. When Jim returned from work, they all sat at the dinner table and quietly ate. "Dad?" Billy asked. "Yes, son? I was thinking about what you said this morning. Did you find out what the Bigfoot took or what it was looking for?"
"No."
"Your mother and I thought it was food, but it didn't open any bags or take the garbage. At least not that we can tell. We did notice your sister's old rocking horse was missing, though." Sarah sat up straight. "What?" "I'd thrown the rocking horse away recently, as a leg was broken, and you're 8 now and no longer play with it," he replied. Sarah looked at her mom with a pouting expression, as if waiting for her mom to say something. But it was Billy who spoke next. "Why would a Bigfoot take a human toy?" "Your mother and I think it may have children of its own, or maybe the neighbors or someone else took it with plans to repair it." "Bigfoot children?" Billy repeated out loud, looking at his little sister. "Do you think they like toys like we do?" Sarah added, "Do you think their children play at human playgrounds?" Tammy jumped in and added that it could be possible, but there's no telling. "Besides," she concluded, "we really don't know if the Bigfoot took your rocking horse. Until we do, just keep your eyes open when you guys play outside or with your friends. We still want you two in by dark and no going out after dinner." Life returned to normal, with no more visible bear or Sasquatch activity. That is, until we had our first good snow. It was early November and temperatures dropped enough to allow for about a foot of fresh snow. The following afternoon, Billy came running home, wet from snow, all out of breath and barely able to talk. He said he was out in the canyon checking on his trap lines after the snow stopped, when something strange happened. While walking across a meadow to locate the first game trail in the trees on the opposite side, small branches and sticks started landing in the snow in front of him. He stopped and looked to see who it was, but nobody was out there with him. In fact, his footprints in the snow were the only tracks he could see. When I started walking towards the woods, the sticks appeared to land in the snow again and again, but nobody was there. "Mom, I swear it's the truth." "Maybe it was the wind," Sarah said with a smirk. "But there's more," Billy continued. "I started running to the trees, and then I stopped after I entered the woods. The flying branches had stopped, so I just stood there looking around and listening." "Listening for what?" his younger sister asked. "I wanted to see if someone was out there with me. Then I heard them." "Them?" his mother asked with one raised eyebrow. "Yes. I'm telling you guys the truth, and I'm not kidding. I heard kids giggling." "What would kids be doing way out there in the woods after that snow?" Tammy asked. "I don't know, but I know what I heard." Then Billy quietly asked his mom, "Do you think it could have been that Bigfoot's children?" "What? Let's stop talking about this, and just wait until your father gets home from work. We'll talk more about it then." "Okay." As he turned and went to his room, he glanced over at his sister, and she just shook her head. Both kids were in their rooms when Jim got home from work. Tammy pulled him aside before he went any further to tell him what happened to Billy. "What should we do?" Tammy asked him. "Let me get cleaned up and we can talk afterwards. I really need a hot shower right now." Tammy went back into the kitchen and started warming up dinner. She called the kids to help set the table and get cleaned up. She stopped Billy and told him his father was taking a shower and that he could talk about his encounter during dinner, but only if his father asked him about it. Your father had a long day and wants to unwind, so you should be respectful of your father's wishes. All right, Mom, Billy said as he continued setting plates on the table. That evening, the dinner table discussion turned out to be more interesting than anyone could have expected. After Billy shared what happened with his father, Jim sat there quietly and said nothing for about 5 minutes. The kids just looked at him and then over at their mom. Billy remembered to respect his dad and that he had a long day. Everyone just waited for him to look up from his plate and say something. Tammy reached over and touched Jim's arm, asking, "Is everything okay?" He looked up and then at her. Then he looked at the kids across the table from him. "What's wrong, Dad?" asked Sarah. He smiled and said, "Everything's fine, honey. Daddy just had a long day." Billy spoke up and asked what he thought of his experience in the meadow earlier and who he thought might have thrown those branches. Jim turned to look at Tammy and gave a sigh. "I have something to tell all of you, but I don't know how to begin. I suppose I should start with Billy and what happened this afternoon, but I think I'll start with what happened to me this morning." "What happened, Dad?" asked Billy. "This morning on my way to work, it was still dark out and I had my brights on going through the canyon. Before the turnoff, I noticed something large standing on the side of the road and just at the edge of my lights. As I slowed for the turn, it stepped out into the road so I could see it." "What was it, Daddy?" Sarah interrupted. "It stood on 2 legs like the Bigfoot that visited us last summer, but it was reddish-brown, not black like the one that picked through our garbage. It was also a female." Jim looked back at Tammy with a blank gaze and took a few deep breaths and collected his thoughts. "Honey, when I came home and you told me what happened to Billy, my mind started spinning. In the shower, I hoped the steam and hot water would help to clear my mind, but it didn't." "What do you mean, Jim?" she asked. After a long pause and a drink from his glass of water, he continued. "The Sasquatch walking out in the road ahead of me wasn't the only strange thing that happened this morning. I don't understand what's happening or why. Maybe there's some logical explanation. I just don't know." Jim slowly continued. "After the morning shift change, the night crew packed up and went home. I was all alone in the office. One of the guys left an unopened can of Dr. Pepper out on the counter, and I put it outside on the cement post near the door. I figured it would be cold in about 30 minutes. After my morning checks, I opened the door and reached for the soda, but it was gone. I walked around in the dark and cold air looking for the can of pop, but I couldn't find it. As I scratched my head and turned to go back inside, I thought I heard giggling, like that of children. I lived in a condominium a mile from town center. It was an efficiency or studio unit and was located on the 2nd floor at the back of the building facing the mountain. It was a cool summer evening and I had the window over my bed open. That's when I heard the first strange sound of the night. It sounded like nails being pulled from a piece of wood. I got out of bed and went outside onto the deck. I listened and looked around. It was dark and my eyes took a minute to adjust. There it was again. The sound came from down below at the next door neighbor's cabin. Then I made out the shape of an animal in the darkness. It was a bear. The bear was tearing wood siding off the cabin, trying to get inside. Evidently, that portion of the cabin was the food pantry and the bear could smell the food. I hollered at the bear and it moved on. Back in bed and on the verge of dozing off, a new sound startled me awake. This time, though, it was different. It was an animal crying out. If you've ever heard a deer kill, that's exactly what it sounded like. Again, I went out onto the deck and listened. The noise was coming from a home on the opposite side of the small valley. I suspected a particular residence where the deer are known to hang out. They are fed by the homeowners and feel safe there. I've seen them laying around the yard all day long, as if waiting for their next meal. The crying sound I heard was like a fawn being killed. I didn't hear coyotes all night, so it could have been killed by a mountain lion. I got back in bed and thought about where I was and the wildlife that lived in the mountains that surrounded my condo. That's when I decided to invite the Sasquatch to come visit. Using my thoughts, I sent them an invitation. I figured they would come down the steep, timber-riddled slope across from me and behind the home where the deer was just killed. Having forgotten about my invite, and several months later, I met a woman who managed a condominium complex at the other end of town. I don't recall how we ended up on the subject, but she told me that when she first moved to the area, she rented a unit where I was living. In fact, she had been just down a couple units from me on the back of the building. She recalled hearing a strange noise early one evening. She stepped outside and listened. Whoop. She told me it was a very loud whoop sound, and whatever was making it was heading down the mountain slope toward a barking dog tied up outside a house below. Whatever it was moving downhill fast and hooped repeatedly, driving the dog nuts. Then when it reached the bottom and was probably in the backyard of the home, the dog fell silent. "What did you do?" "Well," she answered, "I pulled out my phone and got on Facebook. I sent out a post asking my friends if they knew what animal hooped. Nobody responded, but that's about the time the creature started making its way back up the mountain, again, whooping as it went." I found her story fascinating and was a bit upset that I wasn't there when it happened. She asked me what I thought it was, and I told her. I even told her of my invitation to the Sasquatch and that I felt they would come down that slope. While that was the case, they came down behind a different house, which was at the other end of the valley, not where the deer was killed. "Do you believe in Bigfoot?" she asked. I said yes and shared a few of my encounters. In the weeks and months to follow, her and her 3 daughters started calling me the Bigfoot Man. They soon relocated their family, and I've only seen them a couple times in the years since. As their story goes, they had a possible Bigfoot sighting in western Colorado. Driving late at night with his ex-wife, they were headed west into Utah. It was maybe 11 p.m. on an August night back in the 1970s. There was a construction detour sign on the interstate, so rather than follow the detour, they took an exit their road atlas said would get them around the detour. It led them deep into the Black Ridge Canyon's wilderness. They saw homes for a while, then the paved surface came to an end when they crossed a cattle guard. After going some distance, the road condition continued to get worse, so they decided to turn around and head back to the highway. That's when a large brown creature walked across the road ahead of them on 2 legs. It walked through the light of their high beams and looked right at them before continuing into the woods on the other side of the road. He said it had yellow eyes and that his girlfriend also saw it. Was it a Bigfoot? He won't say, only that neither of them knew what it was. They sped back up that dirt road as fast as they could go. This happened back in the days when people had paper road atlases in their vehicles. Their map said the road they were on would join up with the interstate ahead, but it never did, at least as far as they could tell. The road conditions only worsened the deeper into the forest they drove. I was talking with a restaurant owner about some of the Bigfoot stories people had shared with me. The first story was about a woman living near the Colorado-New Mexico border. She told me that she often catches the Sasquatch looking in the windows of her house and that they often leave tracks all over her property. One time, when her visiting sister was returning to the house from her car, she noticed a large brown-haired Sasquatch walking up the mountain behind the house. As you can imagine, the restaurant owner didn't believe a word I said. It would turn out the following morning a customer came in and sat down for breakfast. She greeted him and asked where he was from. His answer was the exact same town from my story. "Really?" she asked. "Have you ever seen a Bigfoot?" The man turned completely pale and said, "Well, yes. That's why I'm here right now." He continued, "A couple days ago, a team of guys and I were cutting firewood in a permit area when a large rock suddenly landed between myself and the other men. I looked at the rock and then up at the men. They were frozen with fear and staring at the tree line behind me. I turned to see what they were looking at. There, standing in the open about 40 yards away, was a large Sasquatch, around 7 to 8 feet tall. We all dropped our gear and raced down the mountain in our trucks." He added that all their equipment was still up there and that he was trying to figure out how to retrieve it over breakfast, as none of the other men wanted to go back with him. For the next story, it's important to know that the location was along a busy road and in the middle of the day. Oddly too, there were around 20 people stopped to stretch their legs or something. Apparently, they were not all traveling together. For as long as I've lived in the area, I've never seen so many people there. To have such an encounter in midday, with so many people walking around, and for the Sasquatch to be standing in the open, just makes this more remarkable. "Remember that day we pulled off to see what everyone was doing?" he asked. "Yes," I replied. "Well, while you were taking pictures of the beaver dam, I walked along the riverbank while looking down into the river for potential fishing holes. Remember?" "Yes. At one point, I looked up and across the river into the woods, and I think I saw a Bigfoot." Now shocked, I said, "What?" "Yeah, it was standing motionless in the open less than 30 feet from me. When I realized it was staring at me and we made eye contact, I pulled my head down and looked away, thinking to myself, oh shit. Wait, that was 3 years ago and you're just now telling me?" "Yeah." I didn't know what to say. "What else happened?" I asked. "Well, after looking away for a moment, I lifted my head and looked back towards it. It had moved back into the woods and was swaying back and forth from behind a tree. There was also a woman nearby that I called over to ask if she could see it too." "Right. I remember seeing her beside you as you pointed into the woods." "Yeah, that's when I asked her if she saw it." "What did she say?" "Well, she just stood there for a moment, then asked me if that was my friend. Evidently, she saw us pull up and exit the Jeep, so she had seen you." He continued, "After I answered that you weren't 9 feet tall and all black, she paused for a second while trying to comprehend what she was seeing. She finally asked, 'Is that a Bigfoot?' He turned towards her and said that he didn't know. When they looked back across the river, it was gone. Then I spotted it maybe 50 feet or more to the right. It was shaking another tree. That tree looked to be about 14 inches in diameter. The whole tree was swaying as it rocked it with just its arms." "What do you mean, its arms?" "It grabbed the tree and shook it, you know, without using its entire body to force the tree to move. I can't believe you didn't tell me about this for 3 years, especially after saying you wanted to see one." "I know. I needed time, I guess, to think about what I really saw and if it really was a Sasquatch," he replied. That's the end of his encounter, but I'd like to add something to his overall experience. Whenever he was in town visiting during the 3 years since having this experience and before telling me about it, he'd crash at my place. Before going to bed each night, I'd download several Bigfoot encounter stories from different YouTube channels and set them to play on my computer in the living room. Some of them were over an hour long, and he'd listen to them while crashed on the couch. I can't say how many hours in all he consumed of other people's Bigfoot encounter stories, but I think they all helped him cope with the trauma of what shocked his beliefs that day. Even after he returned to Florida, he continued to listen to people's stories, and that gave him the courage and confidence to tell me what he experienced that day. Though it was a non-threatening experience, it still shook him to his core and challenged his beliefs. In the days, weeks, and months that followed, he searched his memories of any other times he may have experienced Bigfoot activity, namely, while deer hunting on his family farm in Indiana. This was prompted by many of the Bigfoot show call-ins he listened to by fellow hunters. For example, he recalls the time he heard what he always thought was a smack on water by a beaver's tail, but now wonders if it was a tree knock on a tree from Sasquatch. His mind told him it was probably just a beaver, even though he knew they didn't have beaver. Then there's the tree falling close to him while he was perched silently in his tree stand listening for deer. He said it was so loud and close. It sounded like a huge tree crashing to the ground. It really startled him, as he didn't hear anyone else out there with him, and it was so sudden. When he was done hunting for the day, he climbed down from his stand and went in search of the tree. To this day, he's never found it, and that's confused him. Hearing other people call into Bigfoot podcasts and YouTube shows to detail their strange run-ins with Bigfoot and/or dogmen is helping to make sense of many memories he's had over the years while hunting.